In the warm hush of Egypt's ancient dawn, where the Nile flowed like a ribbon of memory and the wind danced softly over golden sand, there were thoughts that could not be seen, whispers that clung to the corners of temples, shadows that lived, not in the body, but in the invisible chambers of the soul. The ancient Egyptians had no word for mental illness as we understand it, but they felt its presence deeply when a man wandered the streets talking to himself, when a child wept, without cause, when a mother's eyes grew hollow after grief. They believed it was the spirit of the mind, unseen forces stirring within the chest, confusing the heart, dimming the clarity of thought like sand drifting into an open eye. They looked not to the brain, for the brain meant nothing to them. It was discarded during mummification, pulled out through the nose and thrown away. What mattered was the IB, the heart. To the Egyptian mind, the heart was everything. It thought, it remembered, it decided. If your heart was troubled, your very soul trembled. And so, when madness crept in, they believed it had taken root, not in the skull, but in the sacred heart, the divine compass of your being. And when the heart faltered, so too did your grip on the world. Madness, sorrow, delusion, these were not merely illnesses. They were disturbances in the cosmic balance, reflections of something larger gone wrong. Perhaps the gods had turned their gaze away from you. Perhaps an angry spirit had attached itself to your breath. Or perhaps your own soul had wandered too far into the daughter. The shadowy realm of the dead and had brought back something it shouldn't have. Whatever the cause, your suffering was more than personal. It echoed across the worlds of the living and the dead. For the Egyptians, all life was spiritual. A cough might be a demon's whisper, a nightmare, a god's warning, a trembling hand, the touch of an unseen ghost. So when someone became lost in their own mind, seeing things that weren't there, speaking in riddles, weeping at nothing, the people around them didn't ask what was wrong. They asked who had come to visit them, who had taken hold of their spirit, who had clouded their heart. In quiet village homes and grand temple halls, the afflicted were brought before priests, not doctors, but divine intermediaries, men trained not only in healing herbs, but in the language of the gods. The priests would listen carefully, not to the words the sufferer said, but to the rhythm of their breath, the twitch in their fingers, the trembling in their soul. Then they would light incense, always incense, sweet, thick, sacred. The smoke would curl into the air like a staircase for spirits, beckoning them downward. The priest would speak ancient spells, passed down from the times of gods who walked among men. These incantations weren't spoken in haste. They were whispered, drawn out like honey from the comb, syllables that floated and hung in the air like cobwebs of sound. They called on Isis, healer of sorrow. They called on Thoth, keeper of wisdom. They called on Bastet, mother of serenity. These gods, it was believed, could reach into the troubled heart and set it right again. But even the gods needed help, and so the priest would give the sufferer a charm. Sometimes, a tiny amulet of carnelian shaped like the eye of Horus, watching over them even when they could no longer watch over themselves. Sometimes, a small scarab beetle carved from green feldspar, its tiny legs frozen in time, meant to carry the soul back toward order and light. The charm was worn over the heart, always the heart dot. At times, healing required silence. The sick were led to small, darkened rooms deep inside the temple's inner sanctum. There, they were left alone, save for the flicker of oil lamps and the breath of sacred statues carved in stone. It was believed that in this silence, the afflicted could hear something deeper, the voice of the divine, whispering back their own name, calling them home. Water played its role too. The Nile was more than a river, it was a healer. The mentally disturbed were sometimes brought to the edge of its sacred flow and washed with holy water, their skin bathed in lotus and blue water lily, their bodies anointed with oils scented with myrrh and juniper. The belief was that the spirit of the Nile could cleanse not just the flesh, but the spirit, carrying away madness the way it carried silt from the soil. In the dream chambers of certain temples, a deeper kind of healing unfolded. Here, the troubled would be lulled into sleep, not ordinary sleep, but a sacred slumber, a dream incubation, where the gods were invited to enter the sleeper's mind and show them what was wrong. Priests would then interpret these dreams, picking through symbols like stars in the sand, hoping to uncover what the divine had whispered in the dark. If a person screamed in the night, or trembled without cause, it was said they were touched by Sekhmet, the lion-headed goddess of destruction and healing. She who brought plagues could also lift them. Offerings were made bowls of wine, bread shaped like eyes, incense burned until it wept. A plea, not for mercy, but for balance, to take away the fire she had placed in the soul. Some minds were afflicted by lover sickness in its own right. The papyri speak of men unable to sleep, unable to eat, haunted by visions of a lover's face. For this, spells were written on scraps of linen or papyrus, buried in gardens or worn inside sandals. These were not exorcisms of demons, but of desire tangled, aching, obsessive. Love, too, could unmake the heart, and when all else failed, when prayers and baths and amulets did not restore the mind, the people turned to stories, myths and parables told not to entertain, but to remind the broken that even gods had suffered. Madness. Even Osiris had been torn apart and put back together. Even Ra had grown weary. Even the divine could be lost and found again. To the ancient Egyptians, suffering was not shameful. It was a message, an imbalance that needed ritual, not ridicule. Their compassion was woven into their magic. Their understanding was deep, even if not scientific. They believed the world was a mirror, and that if a person was broken, it was because something in the world had cracked as well. They did not have diagnoses. They did not label the mind with cold words. Instead, they gave the sufferer a name, a place, a purpose. You are not broken. You are in between light and shadow, between gods and men, and that meant you could be guided back. The spirits of the mind were real to them, not metaphor, not symbol, but living forces, as real as the wind and the moon and the desert heat. And though they could frighten and confuse, the Egyptians believed these spirits could also be negotiated with, soothed, understood. You did not fight madness, you listened to it. You asked it what it wanted. In this way, ancient Egypt offered something many modern minds have forgotten, a vision of healing that was not rooted in labels or exile, but in ritual, poetry, and belief. The mind was not a machine to be fixed, but a temple to be tended, a sacred house, sometimes haunted, always holy. And as the desert winds return again, to brush against the pillars of long crumbled temples, perhaps some part of that wisdom remains. Perhaps, in the silence of sleep, the spirits of the mind are still whispering, waiting to be heard. In our modern world, it is the brain we worship, its folds, its firing neurons, its chemistry. We speak of psychology, of trauma, of serotonin and structure. But in the ancient land of Egypt, beneath the shadow of pyramids and the eternal stare of sphinxes, the brain meant almost nothing. It was not honored, it was not revered. In fact, during mummification, it was extracted through the nose and discarded like waste, scraped away like meaningless residue. The seat of thought, they believed, lived elsewhere. It lived in the IB, the heart. To the ancient Egyptians, the heart was everything. It was not merely a pump of blood, not just a vessel of life. It was the core of being. It was where your vital essence dwelt. Your thoughts, your memories, your morality, your pain. The heart was your judge and your storyteller. And when something went wrong within your mind, they didn't say your head was ill. They said your heart had been disturbed. This belief permeated every layer of their culture. In sacred texts and medical papyri we find not discussions of cranial damage or mental chemistry, but careful attention to the weighing of the heart, a ceremony in the afterlife where your IB would be placed upon a scale, balanced against the feather of Mat, goddess of truth and harmony. If your heart was heavy with sin, sorrow, guilt, it would be devoured by Ammit, the Skeletor. And so, it was not enough to live rightly, he had to feel rightly. To dot the brain, by contrast, was nameless in their rituals. It had no spiritual authority. It was not painted in tomb murals or invoked in hymns. The ancients believed the brain was merely the cooling organ, responsible for regulating the temperature of the body, not the seat of consciousness. In their view, it was the heartbeat that echoed with thought. When someone began to lose their grip on reality, speaking to shadows, screaming in the night, or forgetting the names of their children, was understood that their heart had been compromised, not diseased in the physical sense, but spiritually misaligned. Perhaps it had grown heavy with grief, or perhaps a spell had been placed upon it, a curse that had tangled the strings of memory and emotion. The ancient physicians, known as SNOE, often treated such afflictions not with scalpels or tools, but with soothing balms, herbs, and words. Recipes were written that blended honey, myrrh, blue lotus, and acacia oil applied to the chest, the heart, the sacred core. They believed that healing the emotions meant tending to the center of the soul. In one preserved spell, a priest chants softly over a troubled woman, describing her heart as a garden scorched by fire, thirsty for cool water. He does not touch her head. He lays his hands above her heart and whispers the names of gods who can return it to peace. The woman, it is written, falls into sleep like a leaf returning to the river. This understanding of the heart shaped even their art. When scribes illustrated scenes of emotion, joy, grief, rage, they did not draw eyes wide or brows furrowed. They placed glowing, radiant hieroglyphs upon the chest. The heart shone when a man loved. It flickered when a woman mourned. The chest was not just the site of breath, it was where the gods whispered. And so, when illness came to the mind, treatment flowed through the heart. A person who could no longer speak clearly was not said to be mad, but to have forgotten their heart's language. They were taken to priests and healers who would bathe them in sacred water, rub oils infused with crushed pomegranate over their chest, and recite long, lyrical prayers in hopes that the heart would remember itself. Even in death, the heart was the one organ kept whole within the body, while the lungs and stomach and intestines were stored in canopic jars under the protection of the four sons of Horus. The heart was meant to remain inside the chest. Its presence was crucial for the afterlife journey, for it was the record of your every thought and deed. Without it, you could not stand before Osiris. You could not be reborn. And when, by mistake or misfortune, the heart had been removed, a magical substitute was placed, a scarab carved from green stone, inscribed with sacred spells. This stone heart would speak for you. If your own could not, it would testify on your behalf, declaring your innocence, your sorrow, your sanity, your truth. In temples and in homes, the afflicted would sometimes be asked to wear charms directly over the heart. A golden amulet, a strip of linen with sacred ink, a drop of oil blessed under moonlight. These objects were not decorative. They were tools to quiet the winds inside the chest, to still the flapping wings of fear. Even love, the most joyous of sicknesses, was believed to reside in the heart. A man stricken with obsession was said to be pierced in his eye. The remedy was not counsel, but ritual, often involving food and flowers, and the writing of a name upon papyrus, folded and worn near the heart until the fever of longing passed. One poetic text describes the heart as a bird made of fire, which could lift you to joy or burn you from within. To soothe, it was to call upon Hathor, goddess of pleasure, or to whisper to Thoth, the master of sacred order. A troubled heart could be rewritten. It just needed guidance back to its divine rhythm. Modern medicine speaks of neural pathways and synapses. Ancient Egypt spoke of balance, of mat, of cosmic order. A troubled mind was simply a mirror of a heart that had drifted too far from harmony, and so they brought it back, slowly, gently, with music, oils, and prayer. And maybe, just maybe, they were not so far off. Perhaps the heart does hold its memories. Perhaps emotion is not entirely chemical, but rhythmic, poetic, held in the silent beat beneath our ribs. Perhaps healing, true healing, begins not in analysis but in attention to the center of the self, the throne of sorrow and song. In the land of Egypt, the heart was not a metaphor. It was a map, a guide, a guardian. And even now, as we forget the old stories and silence the old gods, the heart remains, beating its ancient truth beneath our sleep, waiting, always, to be heard. In a land shaped by myth and memory, where the desert hummed like a living creature and the Nile pulsed like a god's breath, the ancient Egyptians turned to magic not as fantasy, but as medicine. When the heart was sequin, the soul drifted from reason, or the mind trembled like a reed in the wind. They reached for words older than stone. Spells were not charms to amuse. They were instructions for the universe. They were architecture for the invisible. And when sanity began to unravel, these spells became threads that wove the person back together. They called it Heka, not just magic, but a divine force, the same power the gods used to create the world. Heka flowed through priests and poets, through ink and breath, through the blood of the scribe and the voice of the healer. And in the treatment of mental affliction, it was Heka that spoke directly to the madness, coaxing it back into silence, or bargaining with it to leave. There were scrolls and spells specifically for those who suffered in mind. Some were preserved in what we now call the Ebers papyrus, others scattered in fragments across forgotten tombs and library ruins. These spells didn't offer a diagnosis. They offered a dialogue with the gods, with the body, with the unseen, entities that might have entered through grief, jealousy, or the thin veil between life and death. Imagine a woman, her eyes glassy, her hands twisting like vines in the air. She speaks to things that are not there. Her family, frightened, brings her to the temple. There, in the coolness of incense and polished limestone, the priest prepares a spell. Not a prayer, but a verbal formula, crafted with precision. Words were arranged like bricks in a pyramid, each syllable sacred, meant to strike the world. In a certain way, the priest begins not by speaking to the woman, but to the force within her. He addresses the spirit, the shadow, the pain. "Depart from her," he says, in a voice that does not rise. "This body is not yours. Her heart belongs to Hathor, her breath to Thoth. Her name is protected. The spell is not shouted. It is whispered, always whispered, loud enough for the gods to hear, but soft enough not to frighten the soul." The words are often accompanied by action. As he chants, the priest may draw a protective circle in crushed turquoise, or pour libations of milk and honey upon the floor. These are offerings to calm the spirit, to show it that there is no war, only negotiation. Madness was not cast out with violence, it was released with reverence. Some spells call upon Isis, the goddess of healing, who restored her husband Osiris from the grip of death itself. Others invoke Base, the dwarf god with the lion's face, guardian of the home and protector against nightmares. Base was especially loved by women and children, and often called upon when the afflicted cried out in sleep or trembled without cause. At times, the spell would be written on a piece of papyrus, soaked in beer or wine, and then drunk by the afflicted. The idea was not that the paper itself held power, but that the ink carried sacred vibration, that the words would pass through the body and rewrite the disorder from within, healing from the inside out, not with surgery, but with sound. Other spells were burned. The smoke carried the words into the unseen realms. The mind was believed to live in many layers, and some spirits could only be reached through Fira language. The gods understood best. The smoke curled around the sufferer like a net of light, a veil of command. It told the madness it had been seen, named, and now must go. But not all spells were for expulsion. Some were for comfort. When the heart had been wounded by betrayal, by grief, by the loss of a child or a lover, spells were sung to restore joy, to call laughter back into the bones. These were called healing utterances, and often ended not in silence, but in musica, harp, a flute, a tambourine played in slow, looping rhythm to remind the soul what happiness once felt like. The walls of certain tombs bear these spells, still etched in red and black ink, spells for the dead to carry with them, in case the madness followed them into the afterlife. In this way, even the underworld had therapists, and the Book of the Dead was also a book of healing for the mind. There are spells to stop a person from screaming in the night, spells to halt intrusive thoughts, described poetically as the whispering of the serpent in the ear. There are spells for those who wander, unable to sit still, believed to be chased by a wind spirit that kept their feet from resting. Each of these incantations is filled with metaphor, but make no mistake, to the Egyptians, they were as real as illness itself. And still more spells were used, preventively carried on amulets, written on the walls of homes, or whispered to children before sleep. The idea was not to wait for madness to come. It was to guard the mind like a garden, to plant within it seeds of divine order, so that chaos had no soil in which to grow. Sometimes the spell would be performed at night, under a sky of stars sharp as knives, with the Milky Way flowing above like a road for souls. The priest would kneel beside the afflicted, holding a bowl of water, murmuring words into the reflection of the moon in the surface. As Ra returns from the duat, he might say, "So shall your mind return from darkness." The words were spoken not just once, they were repeated, again and again. The belief was that repetition etched the soul back into shape, like a sculptor with a chisel of sound. And even if the madness did not lift right away, the rhythm of the spell created a pattern of music that calmed the tides within. In some healing rites, the entire community participated. A family might encircle the sufferer, each person saying a line of the spell. This was not just ritual, it was remembrance, a way of telling the person, "You are not alone, you are seen, you are still here. Your madness is not your exile." And when the spell ended, the silence was honored. No one spoke. They listened for breath, for stillness, for the faint sound of the world resettling itself. because a true spell does not end with words. It ends when something invisible has been restored. In this forgotten way of healing, there is something hauntingly beautiful, a belief that words, sacred and precise, can reach even the deepest fractures of the self, that the right sound, spoken with reverence, can draw the soul back to shore. And perhaps, as we sleep tonight under our electric stars, some of those old spells still drift in the air, soft, patient, waiting to be remembered. In the golden hush of ancient Egypt, where life pulsed between desert and river, the senses were not distractions, they were gateways. The smell of blue lotus, the hush of a reed flute, the soft rustle of linen robes. To heal a troubled mind, the Egyptians turned not only to gods and spells, but to the world of sensation, to the soft and sacred stimulation of smell and sound. They believed the mind could be gently led back to balance, not through force, but through beauty. Smell was the first language of the gods. Incense curled through temples like divine breath, winding its way through statues and prayer. Each resin, each petal, each oil held power. When a soul became restless, when fear clenched the heart, or sorrow became a fog, the healers reached for aromatics, believing that the nose could lead the spirit home. Frankincense was burned for clarity, its crisp citrusy smoke believed to cut through confusion, to make the air itself wise. Myrrh, darker and more solemn, was for sorrow. It calmed the weeping heart, anchoring it like a stone beneath the current. These were not perfumes for the body, they were perfumes for the soul. The most sacred of all was the blue lotus, a flower that bloomed only in sunlight and slept at night. It was soaked in oil, steeped in wine, placed near the heads of the afflicted as they slept. Its scent was said to induce dreams of peace, visions of order. The Egyptians called it session, and believed it was born from the tears of the sun god Ra himself. In moments of madness, when the mind grew sharp and fractured, or the voice of the sufferer rose into screams, priests and attendants would flood the space with calming scent. Bundles of herbs were set alight. Linen strips soaked in scented oils were tied around the wrists or placed over the heart. The fragrance would rise slowly, invisibly, binding the chaos within. Even private homes were equipped with scent bowls, small carved vessels where oil and incense could be heated by candle flame. In times of anxiety or insomnia, these bowls would be lit, the room filled with a familiar smell, a reminder that the world was still safe, that the gods had not turned away. Sound, too, had its sacred role. In the great echoing temples, music was not entertainment, it was medicine. The Egyptians believed that certain tones, when repeated in ritual patterns, could influence the rhythms of the body, the heart, the breath, the nervous system. Just as the Nile had a tide, so too did the mind. Flutes, crafted from bone or reed, played long, winding notes, like wind moving through papyrus fields. Harps, light and high-pitched, were strummed in repeating loops, soft enough to lull, steady enough to anchor the soul. The sistrum, a sacred rattle used by priestesses of Hathor, created a bright, shivering sound believed to dispel spirits of confusion. For the disturbed sound was not only background, it was therapy. If someone suffered hallucinations, music was played to replace the voices. If they couldn't sleep, the harp was played to match the rhythm of their breath, guiding it slower, softer, more still. The music wasn't meant to be understood, it was meant to be felt. Some rituals used chanting, repeated over hours. Priests would intone mantras, long vowels drawn out in breath that barely disturbed the air. These chants vibrated through the walls of the temples, through the stone, into the very body of the sufferer. The idea was simple: let sound speak. Where words failed, there were even spells that required the sufferer themselves to sing. In a soft, wavering voice, they would repeat the name of a god, or a single word of protection. In doing so, they reconnected with their own voice, reclaimed rhythm, became part of their own cure. In healing chambers, water was also made to sing. Priests poured it over vessels shaped like birds or cobras, which transformed the falling droplets into music. These soft, trickling sounds were believed to mimic the voice of the gods, comforting the lost and soothing the disturbed. During healing rituals for madness, both smell and sound were used together. A space would be prepared, dim, warm, thick, with incense. A harp might begin to play as a priestess waved scented smoke over the body. The mind, surrounded by beauty, would slowly loosen its grip on suffering. Like a bird coaxed from a cage, it would begin to flutter back, No part of the ritual was accidental. Even the sequence of smells was important. The day might begin with cedar to awaken strength, move into lotus for calming, and end with myrrh to anchor the spirit into sleep. Just as a healer might prescribe steps of a spell, so too they choreographed scent like a dance of memory. In some temples, therapeutic music was played constantly, not loud or intrusive, but a soft undertone to daily rituals. This was not only for the sick. It was believed that exposure to sacred sound could prevent spiritual imbalance. Much as eating bread nourished the body, they also believed that children and the elderly were most vulnerable to the unseen forces that caused madness, and so their homes were kept fragrant garlands of herbs hanging near the door, bowls of perfumed oil set beneath sleeping mats, songs sung at twilight like invisible shields. To treat grief, the mourning were bathed in oils infused with basil and mint, while a single flute played outside the room. For those touched by night terrors, their bedding was sprinkled with crushed flowers and dried cinnamon bark. No wound of the mind was too small to deserve comfort. Even color and sound were woven together. Certain colors, deep lapis blue, gold, soft ivory, were considered harmonious to the senses, and healing rooms were decorated with these shades. Sound flowed through these colors, creating an environment meant to balance the soul on every level. And when the healing was complete, when the sufferer no longer shook or wept or stared into nothingness, the final act was always the same: a ritual anointing, where fragrant oil was poured over the crown of the head, while a final note was sung into the room. It marked the return of order. The soul had come back. The mind, like a bird once lost, had remembered the way home. In this ancient practice, smell and sound were not luxuries. They were sacraments, proof that beauty itself could be curative. That a broken mind didn't need punishment, it needed gentleness. And even now, when we light candles to relax or listen to rain as we sleep, we echo something very old. The Egyptians believed that madness was not just chaos, it was disharmony. And to bring back harmony, they used the language that gods themselves had gifted: perfume and music, scent and song, medicine not for the flesh, but for the unseen places where the self hides. And perhaps tonight, as the incense curls into your room and a soft melody finds your ears, some part of your ancient self remembers that to be soothed is not weakness, it is wisdom, and that even in silence, healing can sing. In the ancient lands where sand met starlight, and pyramids cast their long shadows over the bones of forgotten kings, the Egyptians knew one truth above all: the unseen is more dangerous than the seen. Illness of the body could be touched, diagnosed, satisfied, but illness of the mind, confusion, sorrow, fear, voices that whispered when no one else was near, these were enemies that moved like smoke. To fight them, the Egyptians turned to amulets and talismans. Sacred objects meant not merely to protect, but to guide the soul back to balance. An amulet was never just a charm. It was a prayer made solid, a word frozen in gold, in lapis, in clay. The sick and troubled wore them around their necks, pressed them to their hearts, tucked them into linen wrappings like secret wishes. These small tokens were believed to hold Hekatha, divine energy that the gods themselves had used to form the world. If a spirit of madness had entered the heart, a talisman could draw it out, or better still, keep it from ever entering. One of the most beloved symbols was the Eye of Horus, or Wedget. Shaped like a stylized eye, it represented healing, restoration, and divine vigilance. Those whose minds wavered, who forgot where they were, or wept without reason, were often given an Eye of Horus to wear close to their chest. It was said to see what they could not, to watch over them when their own awareness had dimmed. The scarab beetle, a creature that pushed the sun across the sky in myth, was another frequent companion. Its round body, carved into green stone or gold, was pressed against the skin to remind the heart to keep moving, to rise again, no matter how many times it had been buried in darkness. For the mentally afflicted, the scarab meant rebirth, a promise that even shattered thoughts could be gathered and rolled into something whole. The ankh, symbol of life, was often placed in the hands of those caught in despair. Depression, though unnamed in their language, was not unseen. Healers recognized the signs: of quietness that wouldn't lift, a heaviness that bent the back. The ankh was a reminder that life itself still flowed, and that the gods had not yet called the soul away. These amulets were not bought or found. They were made with intention. A priest would bless the materials. The symbols would be carved under sacred conditions on certain days, at certain hours, while specific words were spoken. Each mark carried a vibration. Each line etched was a map back to harmony. Some talismans were more obscure. There were carved lions to ward off fear, tiny dwarves to dispel nightmares, papyrus scrolls with inscriptions so small they could only be read by candlelight, rolled tightly and worn as pendants. These were personalized medicine chosen not by symptom, but by spirit. For children afflicted with night terrors. A small figurine of base, the dwarf god with a lion's mane and tongue, stuck out, was placed near the bed. He was both comical and terrifying, a friend to the innocent, and a terror to demons. His presence was said to make evil spirits flee in confusion. His smile, strange as it was, meant safety. Women who suffered after childbirth, who drifted into sadness, fear, or silence were often given amulets of Toret, the hippo goddess of fertility and protection. She cradled both child and mother in her stone embrace, reminding the weary that motherhood was not a punishment, and that even goddesses had labors of their own. Some amulets were soaked in sacred oils before being worn. Others were warmed in the sun, so that they might absorb Ra's light. The wearer would press the warm charm to their chest, believing that divine heat would burn away the shadows clinging to their soul. A person in mental distress might wear multiple talismans, tied with linen cords that crossed their body like a web. The cords themselves were sometimes knotted in sacred numbers: 3 for protection, 5 for balance, 7 for divine order. Each knot held meaning. Each wrap was a gesture of hope. Talismans were not always worn. Some were buried at thresholds, placed beneath sleeping mats, or hidden in the walls of homes. Madness, it was believed, could enter through doors or dreams. A charm near the entrance meant the spirit of confusion would lose its way, turned back, before it could enter. If an amulet broke, it was not discarded. It was taken to a priest, who would read the cracks like a diviner reads the stars. Sometimes it meant the danger had passed. Other times it meant the protection had failed. Either way, the object was honored for its sacrifice it had stood. Between a soul and its unraveling, the creation of talismans was considered a sacred profession. Certain artisans, known not by name but by symbol, specialized in these objects. They worked in silence, often fasting before carving, believing their purity affected the power of the piece. They were not merely craftsmen, they were keepers of spiritual keys. Not all talismans were obvious. Some were woven into clothing, their symbols hidden in embroidery. Others were written in ink on thin papyrus, dissolved in wine, and consumed, so that the protective magic would move through the body itself, unseen but present. When a person began to heal, when clarity returned, when laughter emerged, when the eyes lost their glassy sheen, the talismans were not removed. They were kept nearby, reminders of the journey, proof that the gods had listened, that the darkness had been seen and survived. Sometimes, families kept talismans for generations. A charm that once protected a grandmother from madness might be passed down to a granddaughter. It was more than tradition. It was belief that healing leaves echoes, and that old protections can still whisper safety across time. In tombs, we find amulets buried not just for the journey to the afterlife, but to protect the soul from the madness of eternity. Even in death, the mind could lose itself. Even in peace, the soul might be tempted by sorrow. These charms ensured the deceased remained whole then, now, and forever. In the modern world, we wear jewelry for fashion. But in ancient Egypt, to wear symbol was to declare your soul's intention to live, to be protected, to remember, to reclaim sanity one breath at a time. And while their beliefs were wrapped in myth, their compassion was real. They gave the afflicted something to hold, something to believe in. And perhaps that is what talismans truly were, not magic in the way we think of it, but anchors, anchors for the spirit. A way to say, you are still here, you are still whole. This small object carries a God's promise, and it will not let you drift too far. So tonight, as your body sinks into rest, imagine a scarab resting on your chest. Imagine the eye of Horus watching from just above your breath. Imagine the gods, leaning close, not with judgment, but with gentleness. And let their ancient protection wrap around you like linen in the dark. In the land where gods once whispered through reeds and stone, where sunlight danced across columns as tall as memory, there stood the temples, not merely places of worship, but living sanctuaries of healing. These were not the bustling, public shrines where the multitudes gathered. These were quieter sanctums, veiled in incense and mystery, and for those whose minds had frayed, whose hearts had become tangled in sorrow or fear, these temples were the final hope, the shelters for the soul's return. Temple healing was unlike anything found in the streets or marketplaces. It was not loud, it was not fast. It was ritual, wrapped in slowness, in silence, in sacred space. These temples were curated worlds, designed with precise architecture to soothe the unseen. Every echo mattered, every scent had meaning. The very walls were inscribed with divine geometry, symbols believed to align the mind with the cosmos. When a person arrived in need, they were not treated as ill, they were treated as sacred. Something had misaligned their solar disturbance, a shadow, a touch from the duat, and so they were welcomed not with questions, but with anointment, a warm cloth on the forehead, a touch of oil beneath the throat. The temple's silence was their first medicine. They would be led gently, slowly into the inner chambers, where the air was thick with myrrh, and time itself moved slower. These spaces were often dim, lit only by flickering oil lamps, whose flames danced like spirits. In these low-lit corners of eternity, the afflicted were asked to lie down, to surrender their weight to stone and stillness. Sometimes, the healing began with music, a priestess plucking the strings of a small harp in a rhythm designed not for the ears, but for the heartbeat. The tones reverberated through the air, weaving a net of sound where thought could safely drift. Over time, the vibrations were believed to soften the hardness of the mind, like water shaping stone. In some temples, holy water from the Nile, stored in sacred pools, was poured slowly over the person's feet or brow. This water had been prayed over, sung into. It was not just for washing, it was for returning the soul to its proper place, washing away the invisible debris that clung to those who had been wandering in mental darkness. One of the most profound temple therapies was dream incubation. In the innermost sanctuaries, sometimes called the sleep chambers of the gods, the afflicted were prepared for sacred rest. A bed was laid out, not too soft, but clean. Fragrant herbs were tucked beneath the mattress. A priest would chant softly over the sleeper, calling down a god to visit their dreams. In this divine sleep, it was believed, the god might show the cause of the affliction not through speech, but through symbols, visions, and feelings. A scorpion might appear to represent venomous thoughts. A storm could symbolize a turbulent soul. When the dream ended, the priest would carefully record the details and interpret them, offering guidance wrapped in poetry. No dream was meaningless, no image ignored. Every flicker behind the eyes was considered a message from the gods, a map out of madness, drawn in the night. Some people required many sleeps, many visits to the dream chamber, before clarity arrived. But the priests never rushed the process. Healing was not a command, it was a courtship. Beyond dreams, ritual purification played a key role. The sufferer might be instructed to fast, to drink infusions of lotus or chamomile, or to avoid certain colors or people. They were slowly realigned with cosmic order. Everything had to be balanced: their food, their sleep, their exposure to light. They were woven gently back into the rhythm of the world. Some temples specialized in healing certain afflictions. A temple of Thoth, god of wisdom, might care for those with racing thoughts or confusion. A sanctuary of Hathor, goddess of joy, might tend to grief or melancholy. The temples were not generalized. They were tailored sanctuaries, each one a unique vessel of comfort and cosmic alignment. The walls of these healing spaces were often carved with sacred texts, long inscriptions of spells and hymns meant to calm the reader's eye. Some were read aloud by the priest, others were traced by the fingers of the patient, their hands moving over the hieroglyphs like reading braille for the soul. Each symbol, each curve, was part of the therapy. In these spaces, there was no shame. Madness was not failure, it was misalignment, a loss of rhythm, a sign that something deeper had been disturbed. And so, the afflicted were not cast out. They were gathered in, held gently by ritual, by community, by the presence of gods who had themselves once suffered and healed. As days passed, the sufferer might be invited to participate in small rituals, lighting incense, pouring libation, reciting a line of a hymn. These acts were not burdens. They were rehearsals for reintegration, gentle ways to remind the person that they still belonged to the world, and the world still belonged to them. When healing began to take hold, when the eyes grew steadier, when laughter returned, when the soul seemed less distant. The final stage was re-emergence, a ritual bath, new linen robes, a blessing spoken at dawn. The person would be led out of the temple with reverence, not as a patient cured, but as a soul reborn. Some were given amulets upon departure, tokens of protection, reminders of the silence that had healed them. Others were instructed to return weekly, to sit once more in the temple's shade, to touch the walls, to remember, because healing was not a single moment. It was a path that curved like the Nile, always moving, always requiring care. In truth, the temple was never meant to fix the mind. It was meant to hold it gently, to create a space where it could soften, settle, reweave itself. The priests and priestesses were not surgeons. They were gardeners of the soul, tending the unseen until order bloomed again. And though the temples have crumbled, their stones scattered, and their sanctuaries buried, perhaps something of their silence remains. Perhaps, in quiet rooms, in candlelight, in whispered prayers before sleep, we still carry the echo of temple healing. And so, as you drift tonight beneath the hush of your own breath, imagine walking barefoot across cool temple stones. Feel the incense wrap around you like silk. Hear the low hum of ancient hymns, long forgotten by the waking world, but remembered now in your dreaming heart. In the ancient hush of Egypt, where the stars were read like scripture and the moon traced secrets into the sands, sleep was never just sleep. It was a passage, a portal, a veil so thin even the gods could pass through it. And when the mind began to fray, when sorrow clung to thought or shadows grew louder than words, the healers turned to dreams. They believed that what the waking world could not explain, the dream world might whisper in symbols. Dreams were not fantasies. They were not the echoes of random thought. To the Egyptians, dreams were messages, sent by God's ancestors or the inner soul itself. They carried truth in metaphor, and within their strange, shimmering logic, healing could be found. The broken mind, they believed, spoke in dreams long before it could speak again in daylight. In temple sanctuaries and quiet chambers, the ritual of dream therapy, known as incubation, was offered to those adrift in confusion, fear, or grief. The sufferer was brought into sacred space where sound softened, where the walls were carved with hymns, and where the air smelled of lotus and oil. There, they would prepare not for surgery or medicine, but for sleeping under divine watch. The sleeper would bathe in sacred water, don clean linen, and be anointed with oils meant to call calm. They might drink a potion brewed with calming herbs, blue lotus for vision, chamomile for rest, fennel for clarity. These were not drugs. They were key ingredients that opened the gates between waking and dream. Before sleep, a priest or priestess would sit beside them and whisper sacred words, not spells of power, but questions for the gods. What troubles your heart? Where has your soul wandered? Who waits for you behind the veil? These were not demands. They were invitations, calling the divine to enter sleep like a guest enters a house. The person would then lie on a specially prepared bed, sometimes near a shrine, sometimes beneath an open sky, where the stars could watch. A sacred object, such as an ankh or a statuette of a god, might be placed beneath the pillow. In this vulnerable state, they were left to the realm of dreams, where no priest could follow, but where the gods might speak directly. The dreams were rarely simple. A lion pacing through a garden, a river flowing backwards, a bird trapped inside a mirror. These were not madness. They were messages, clues. The sleeper would awaken slowly, their body heavy, their heart uncertain. And the first question always asked was not, "How did you sleep?" but "What did you see?" A dream interpreter known as a sacred scribe would sit with the dreamer, listening not only to the words but to the rhythm of their voice, the light in their eyes, the tremble in their breath. Every detail mattered. Was the lion roaring or silent? Did the river run red or blue? Did the bird sing, or was it silent? The interpreter read these not as riddles, but as diagnoses of the soul. A dream of fire might indicate a heart burning with unsaid grief. A dream of crumbling stone could reveal a mind collapsing under guilt. A dream of endless walking might point to restlessness, rootlessness, the absence of belonging. Each symbol was ancient, and each dream map was personal. Once the meaning was uncovered, the healing could begin. Sometimes it required a ritual, a spell to undo what the dream had revealed. Sometimes it meant a change in behavior, or the wearing of an amulet charged with the energy of the dream's message. Sometimes it meant returning to the temple again, night after night, to deepen the vision, to let the dreams speak louder. There were known dreams catalogued in sacred texts, the Book of Dreams, a now lost volume believed to hold hundreds of symbols and their meanings, but no priest relied solely on books. Dream work was intimate, sacred. A priest had to listen with the ears of the heart, not just the knowledge of the mind. In some cases, the dreamer was instructed to draw their dreams too, carve them into wax, to paint them onto potsherds, to give shape to the unseen. This was not art for display, it was therapy, a way to bring the swirling language of sleep into the stable realm of the waking, a way for the sufferer to see their mind on the outside. Dreams could also offer prescriptions. Some dreamers were told by deities to walk barefoot at dawn, or to avoid certain foods, or to bathe beneath the full moon. Others were told to chant a phrase each morning, or to sleep only with their head facing north. These were not random orders. They were believed to be divine instructions, medicine from the gods themselves. Sometimes, a dream would reveal that the affliction was not personal at all. It might be inherited shadow passed down through generations, or it might come from a spirit seeking release, a forgotten soul clinging to the dreamer. In such cases, priests would hold release rituals, speaking prayers not to the dreamer, but to the entity living in the dream. Even nightmares were honored. A terrifying dream was not seen as a curse, but as a warning, a flare sent up by the subconscious or the divine. It was treated not with fear, but with respect. The dreamer might be cleansed again, their bed moved to a different room, their meals altered to calm the energies within. Children too were invited into dream healing. If a child had recurring terrors, they were brought to the temple with gentleness. Their dreams were drawn in chalk, their stories listened to without dismissal. The gods, it was believed, spoke clearest through the young. Their fears were treated as messages worth deciphering. Above all, dream therapy was built on patience. Healing was not forced. A dream could take weeks to reveal its meaning, months to offer resolution, but the priests never pushed. They waited, like the river waits for a flood, like the moon waits for its own light to return. And when healing came, when the dreams became peaceful, when symbols turned from chaos to harmony, the dreamer was blessed, sometimes with a final dream, where a god smiled or touched their forehead, other times with a ceremony, a song sung at sunrise, declaring the soul restored. In this ancient world, therapy did not always happen in dialogue or daylight. It happened in darkness, in stillness, in sleep. And the belief was simple: the mind may forget, but the dream remembers. And through dreams, the gods could do what no mortal could reach, into the soul's deepest night, and light a path back to dawn. In the desert lands of ancient Egypt, where the heat clung like breath, and the Nile curved like a serpent through stone and soil, water was more than life, it was memory, it was medicine. And when the mind became clouded, when thoughts became tangled in fear or grief, the people did not merely treat the brain, they bathed the entire soul. To purify was to begin again, and to bathe was to return, not just to cleanliness, but to clarity, to balance, to sacred alignment. They believed that madness left residue, that spiritual misalignment or unseen forces clung, not just to the heart, but to the skin, to the breath, to the very edges of one's being. And so, when a person grew restless, angry, without reason, withdrawn without explanation, they were led not to a healer's bench but to water. The most sacred waters were those drawn from the Nile at first light, before any foot had disturbed its stillness. This water was collected in ritual jars, prayed over, infused with herbs and oils, and sometimes left beneath the moonlight to absorb the night's calm. What was drawn from the Nile was no longer merely river, it had become liquid order, water that remembered the beginning of the world. Before a ritual bath, the afflicted would be stripped of all jewelry, perfumes, even their linen robes. This was not to humiliate, it was to return them to their raw essence, to shed the identities they had worn so long that they no longer remembered their truest self beneath. To heal, one had to begin naked before the gods. The bath itself was not rushed, it was slow, ceremonial. The water, sometimes warmed over sacred flame, was poured from jars carved with protective musangs, lotuses, serpents coiled in eternal circles. Each symbol whispered its own form of peace. The act of bathing was performed by a priest or healer, their hands trained not only in medicine, but in intention. The purification was not just physical. As water touched the forehead, it was said to wash away heavy thoughts. When it touched the chest, it untangled the threads of grief. When it ran over the hands, it cleansed the actions one regretted. And when it flowed down the feet, it unburdened the paths one had walked in sorrow or confusion. Sometimes herbs were added to the water blue lotus for dreamlike calm, mint for alertness, myrrh for grounding, juniper for spiritual protection. Each bath was tailored to the affliction. The priest would watch the person's breath, their eyes, the way their shoulders held tension, and from that reading, prepare the right infusion. In certain temples, incantations were whispered throughout. The bath's soft words of healing, not heard with the ears but felt in the chest. These chants were meant to harmonize the energies within, to guide the soul gently out of hiding. It was believed that a fragmented spirit could be coaxed into wholeness by the right blend of touch, word, and water. After the bath, the water was never reused. It was sacred, now full of the residue of madness, of sorrow, of the burdens released. It was poured into the earth with care returned to the soil, so that nature could absorb what the person no longer could bear. In this way, the land itself became a participant in the healing. Following the bath, the sufferer was wrapped in fresh linen white or pale blue, the colors of dawn and sky, chosen to symbolize rebirth and lightness. These linens were sometimes embroidered with protective symbols, sewn by the hands of priestesses who had prayed into every stitch. To wear these robes was to wear a new beginning. In some cases, multiple baths were needed, one for sorrow, another for fear, another still for anger or restlessness. Healing was not a single act, it was a series of steps, each one meant to peel back another layer until the self beneath could finally breathe again. Bathing was also used to prepare for other therapies: dream incubation, temple healing, even the wearing of certain amulets. The mind, it was believed, could not receive divine messages if the body still carried the weight of yesterday. The bath was the threshold, the gateway, the invitation to begin again. Special baths were also performed for those in mourning, whose grief had grown too heavy to carry. They were bathed while a priestess sang ancient songs of comfort, songs about Isis, searching for Osiris, about broken love that still remembered joy. The water, laced with rose petals and cedar oil, was meant to soothe not the mind, but the ache lodged deep in the bones. Even children and the elderly were offered ritual purification. Madness, after all, did not discriminate. Children who screamed in the night, who woke with wide, frightened eyes, were bathed in lavender and honey water while their mothers held them. Elders who grew forgetful, who muttered to themselves in the late afternoon, were bathed with Kara, final honoring of their soul's long journey. Baths were not always done in solitude. Sometimes the community watched quietly, reverently, as the sufferer was cleansed. This was not for spectacle. It was to remind them they were not alone, that their pain was witnessed, that their return would be celebrated, not questioned. And when the final bath was done, when the waters had run clear, when the breath was steady and the eyes softer, the person was led to a mirror, not to admire, but to remember, to look into their reflection and see themselves not as sick or lost, but as someone reborn from water, spirit, and time. In a world where madness is so often met with fear or dismissal, the ancient Egyptians offered something quieter, gentler. They offered water warmed by prayer. They offered the human hand, guided by the divine. They offered a return through ritual, not a cure, but a cleansing, not an answer, but an embrace. And perhaps tonight, as you drift to sleep beneath your own blanket of silence, you might imagine the cool trickle of sacred water across your brow. You might hear the soft chanting of long-vanished priestesses. You might feel the linen wrap around you, not to restrain, but to hold. And in that stillness, you remember, you are not broken. You are being bathed in becoming. In the sacred hush of ancient Egypt, where stone met sky, and the sun stitched golden seams into the edge of every temple, music was not entertainment. It was not a thing for pleasure alone. It was medicine, a force so gentle it could move the soul, and so deep it could stir the gods. And when the mind grew restless, when voices crowded in, or sorrow pressed heavily against the ribs, it was not the physician who was summoned first, it was the musician priest, the one who played for the spirit, not the crowd. The Egyptians understood that what is broken in silence cannot always be mended with words, so they listened to sound, not loud or clashing, but soft, patterned, sacred. They believed the body responded to harmony the way the Nile responded to the moon, that the spirit, when lost, could be sung home. Every instrument had its purpose. The harp, with its curved wooden spine and strings like lines of light, was used to soothe. Its notes were slow and circular, never sharp, never sudden, played in open courtyards at dusk. Its melodies wrapped the mind like linen. A person who hadn't slept in days might lie near its echo, and finally close their eyes. The flute, carved from reed or bone, whispered notes that rose and fell like breath. It was used for clarity for those lost in confusion, or whose thoughts spun like dust in a storm. Played in quiet chambers, its tone would follow the rhythm of the listener's breathing, slowly guiding it back to steadiness. Then there was the sistrum, a sacred rattle shaped like a temple doorway, held by priestesses of Hathor. When shaken, its metal discs shimmered with sound bright, almost laughter-like music that was believed to chase away dark spirits. It was never played in sadness, only as a light in the room's far corners, to remind the soul that joy was still possible. For deeper unrest, there was chanting, low, rhythmic vocalizations, not songs as we know them, but vowel sounds stretched into time. Oh, these were believed to resonate through the chest and bones, vibrating not just through air, but through blood and memory. People sat in circles, breathing together, humming together. In those moments, no one felt alone. These chants were not random. They were carefully chosen, each sound corresponding to a different divine force. One chant might call on Mat for balance, another on Thoth for clarity, still another on Sekhmet for strength. The goal was not to impress, but to attune, to bring the person's inner music back into harmony with the universe. The very spaces where music was played were part of the medicine. Some temples had rooms with perfect acoustics, built to amplify only certain frequencies. Others had walls painted with flowing lines to guide the sound, or floors made of specific stone that resonated gently beneath bare feet. The listener was not just hearing the music, they were standing inside it. Even silence was part of the composition. Between notes, between chants, there were pauses. These were intentional. In the gaps, the soul could breathe. In the hush, the body could remember its own rhythm. The Egyptians knew, it is not the endless sound that heals, but the space that allows rest within it. Music was often paired with scent. As the harp played, incense would rise. As voices hummed, oils were rubbed into skin. Sound entered through the ears, scent entered through the breath, and together, they reached places no blade or potion could touch. They reached the wound behind the wound, the grief that had no name, the fear that had no shape. Some instruments were used only at specific times. The double piper, reedy, haunting sound, was often played at twilight, when the boundary between day and night was thinnest. Its tones mimicked the calls of birds and spirits. For those whose minds had wandered too far, this music was a guidepost. Here is the way back. For children, music was lighter. Bells tied to ankles, tambourines tapped with fingertips, lullabies sung with repetition, the same soft phrase over and over like a rope thrown across a chasm. For the elderly, music was slower still. Single tones held for long breaths, like memories stretched into the air. In this music, time softened. The soul relaxed its grip. There were also ritual compositions, passed down through generations, never written, only remembered. They were sung only in certain states of suffering, heartbreak, loss, restlessness, the grief that appears with no cause. These songs were not to cure, but to accompany, to say, you are not the first to feel this, you are not alone. Music was also used in preparation. Before dream therapy, before sacred baths, a harp might play softly to open the heart. A flute might circle the room before a ritual began, brushing away invisible disturbances. Sound was a broom, a bomb, a blessing that moved without hands. Some healers believed each person had a soul tone, a specific note that matched their essence. When the person fell ill or unwell in spirit, they had gone off-key. Music therapy involved finding their tone again, slowly bringing their being back into tune. This was not metaphor, it was real, and it was sacred. There were moments when the music was played only for the gods, and the sufferer listened from afar. It was said that if the gods were pleased, they might send their own resonance back, filling the chamber with warmth, with clarity, with the sound of invisible forgiveness. In tombs, we find instruments buried alongside the dead, harps of wood long since dust, flutes curled like ribs, bells no longer rung. They believed that in the afterlife, the soul would still need music to stay balanced, to stay whole, to remember who it was before the forgetting. Madness was not of this world alone, and neither was healing, and perhaps that is the truest gift music gave. It reminded the sufferer of their true name, not the one spoken aloud, but the one sung beneath the skin, the name only the soul remembers. Music did not cure, it recalled, it invited, it gathered the pieces of the self scattered by fear and pain, and gave them rhythm again. So tonight, as you rest, let the silence around you become a song. Imagine a harp played beneath stars, a single note, soft as breath, winding its way into your chest. Feel it settle there. Feel it call the scattered parts of you home. You are not lost, you are only between notes, and the music has not forgotten you. In the golden silence of ancient Egypt, where the river coiled like a serpent of light, and gods whispered in the wind through papyrus reeds, healing was never only prayer. It was practice. It was the turning of roots, the grinding of powders, the heating of oils over flame. For the sicknesses that lived not in the body but in the heart, in the quiet panic behind the eyes, the fatigue that clung to the ribs, the thoughts that wandered like exiled spirits, Egyptians turned to earthly medicine. They believed the gods had left signatures of healing in the plants, stones, and animals around them. Every leaf held a secret, every scent remembered a purpose. Recipes were passed from temple to temple, scribe to scribe, inked on papyrus scrolls in tight black strokes and red corrections, and among these were the cures not just for wounds or fevers but for what we now call mental illness. One of the most sacred ingredients was blue lotus, its delicate petals folding and unfolding like the sky at dawn. It was steeped into tea, added to wine, or even dried and smoked. Blue lotus was not meant to erase pain, it was meant to loosen the grip of sorrow, to soften the mind into receptivity. For those who were restless, weeping without reason, or unable to sleep, this flower was offered as a balm between worlds. Frankincense and myrrh, more than offerings for the gods, were medicine for the broken mind. Ground into resin and burned slowly over coals, their smoke was inhaled to clear the senses, to drive out intrusive thoughts, to chase demons from the nostrils. As one ancient scroll poetically wrote, the smell itself was considered a spiritual disinfectant, calming not just the body but the unseen energies that clung to it. Another powerful medicine was mandrake root, dug carefully from the soil with chance to avoid disturbing its spirit. It was used rarely, and only in small doses, as its potency bordered the divine and the dangerous. Ground into paste and mixed with honey, it was rubbed onto the temples of those overwhelmed by noise, both internal and external. To use it was to invite a dreamlike stillness, a brief silence in the mind's storm. The most accessible of remedies was honey golden, thick and sacred. Honey was believed to hold the blessings of the gods. It was mixed with crushed herbs or resins and spread over the tongue or beneath the eyelids. For those lost in despair, honey represented sweetness returned, a reminder that the world still held beauty, still held warmth. Fennel seeds, steeped in warm wine, were offered to those who could not concentrate, whose thoughts darted like fish. The wine softened the body, while the fennel cleared the mind. It was said to bring the light of Ra back into the head. One healer recorded that a young man once regained his ability to speak after sipping this mixture by moonlight. For the trembling or anxious, the Egyptians turned to valerian root, ground and stirred into barley beer. Its bitter taste was masked with date syrup, and it was offered in clay cups with prayers to Thoth, the god of equilibrium and thought. This potion did not erase fear, but it stilled the waters so that the soul might see its reflection clearly. Again, many recipes were complex, requiring timing and intention. Certain herbs were picked only at dawn, when dew still clung to them. Others were harvested during full moons or eclipses, when celestial alignments lent power to the earth. Healing, they believed, came not just from ingredients, but from when and how they were gathered. Garlic and onion, pungent and humble, were often overlooked by the modern mind but cherished by ancient healers, crushed and boiled with lentils or wrapped in linen and worn over the chest. These plants were believed to ward off unseen spirits and strengthen the protective energy around the body. For the mind, disturbed by envy, jealousy, or spiritual invasion, these roots acted as shields. Some potions were ingested, others applied topically. A mix of coriander, palm wine, and sycamore sap was sometimes painted across the scalp, then wrapped in cloth. This was said to cool the brain and restore peace. The patient would lie beneath date palms while the wind dried the mixture. and in that stillness they would begin to return to themselves. Animal-based ingredients were rarer but sacred. Bee venom, collected from stingers and diluted into oil, was used in extreme cases, massaged gently into the spine of those too numb to feel. The sting, they believed, reawakened the body, reminding it of life. It was painful, but pain sometimes marked the beginning of presence. Charcoal from sacred fires, ground and stirred into fig paste, was applied to the soles of the feet in cases of insomnia or hallucination. It was said to ground the soul, to bind it back to the earth. In a world where madness was often seen as a drifting away from order, grounding was essential. The patient would walk barefoot afterward, through sand or temple stone, until they felt real again. Some recipes were recited as they were prepared, each step accompanied by a chant or verse, not for magic, but for rhythm, for intentional presence. The healer's breath became part of the medicine. The act of preparing was itself a prayer. Water too was part of these recipes, especially moon water, left overnight in bowls of copper or alabaster, used in mixtures for cleansing. It was said to carry stillness, clarity, and dream. Drinking it before sleep often brought visions, and for those seeking answers to internal unrest, it was a key to the wisdom hidden beneath the noise. Healers kept detailed journals, recipes scribbled in ink from soot and gum, often with notes, worked well on a weeping woman, or calmed a man who thought he was a fish. These scrolls became treasures, passed down from generation to generation, becoming more than medicine. They were maps of compassion, records of what helped and what didn't, and yet none of these recipes were offered without care. The healer would always look first not at the body, but into the eyes. They would ask, "Where do you ache that cannot be touched?" Only then would they open the box of herbs, the jars of oils, the scrolls of knowledge. Medicine was never rushed. It was a conversation with the unseen, and when the potion was finally taken, whether sipped, inhaled, rubbed into skin, it was not followed by questions or expectation, only silence. The patient was left to rest, perhaps with a small statue of Bast or Hathor beside them, and sometimes, that night, they dreamed, not of gods or temples, but of rivers, of childhood, of the scent of figs, dreams that began to mend what the potion had stirred. So tonight, as your eyes begin to close, imagine a healer sitting beside a flickering lamp. Imagine the mortar and pestle turning in rhythm, the scent of crushed petals, the quiet patience of hands that believe that Earth still wants to help us, and know that even now, some part of you remembers. Healing is slow and sacred, and still here. In the ancient hush of Egypt, where temples rose like frozen prayers and shadows slid across limestone with the patience of time itself, the healers knew that not all cures could be given, and not all wounds should be spoken aloud. When the mind frayed, when the soul grew heavy or scattered, they did not always prescribe words, or potions, or chants. Sometimes they prescribed silence, and not the silence of abandonment, but of sanctuary. They understood what many would forget, that noise could be violence, even when well-meaning, that advice, questions, and even kindness could overwhelm a mind already drowning. And so, when a person wept without knowing why, or shook at shadows that others could not see, or stared for hours at nothing, at all, the healer might simply say, "Take them to the quiet place." These quiet places were not cells, nor cages, nor punishment. They were sacred spaces, often deep within temples or far beyond the village walls. Gardens wrapped in sandstone, rooms carved into cliffs, tents beneath stars, always somewhere away, yet not forgotten, always watched from a distance, yet never interrupted. Isolation was not banishment, it was a gift, a soft boundary drawn between the storm within and the world without, a space where the mind could decompress from existence, where the spirit could retreat and rearrange itself without the burden of having to explain. Some of these sanctuaries were so still that even footsteps echoed like thunder. Birds avoided them. Winds circled but did not enter. The very air, it seemed, had made a pact to be gentle. Here, a person might lie for hours, wrapped in linen, the scent of camphor or frankincense curling like a protective veil around their breath. They might say nothing for days, and that was allowed. Speech was not required for healing. Healers would come in shifts, not to interrogate, but to observe. From a respectful distance, they would watch how the person moved, whether they paced or sat still, whether they wept or laughed too loudly, or stared into the earth. These were signs, not symptoms. The body spoke when the mouth could not. Food was given in silence. Simple meals, barley cakes, figs, water sweetened with a drop of lotus oil. Sometimes the person ate, sometimes they did not. No one forced them. Hunger would return when it was ready. Healing, like appetite, moved in its own time. There was no punishment for retreating into silence. In fact, the ancient Egyptians believed that silence was a divine state. The god Harpocrates, a child with a finger to his lips, was a symbol not of secrecy, but of sacred quiet. To be silent was to be near the gods, to listen instead of speak, to receive. The rooms of isolation were designed not to distract, but to calm. Soft light, often indirect, cool stone floors, textures that were smooth beneath the fingertips. Some rooms had walls carved with peaceful scenes, lotus ponds, herons in flight, the sun rising. These were not decoration. They were anchors, images, meant to soothe the visual mind and remind the soul of beauty. Sometimes, a person was given a stone, not magical, just smooth, something to hold, to ground, to feel weight in the hand when the mind felt like wind. Some were given papyrus and stylus to draw, or write, or scribble nonsense. Whatever emerged was treated with reverence. It was the language of the unseen, and it was sacred done in some cases. The person would begin to speak to the silence itself, whispering to the walls, to the gods, to the wind that slid under the door. These murmured monologues were never interrupted. They were the soul's way of unraveling itself, of sorting thought from terror, memory from delusion. When emotions came, tears, anger, fear, they were welcomed, not restrained. A priestess might sit just outside the threshold, humming low and slow, not to drown the noise, but to accompany it. To remind the sufferer, you are not alone in your loneliness. Some were drawn to water during their solitude, ponds, pools, even bowls filled with moonlight and reflection. Water offered a mirror without judgment. Many healers believed that staring into still water allowed the mind to see itself, to notice its own ripples, to remember shape. The silence did not rush. It made no demands. Days might pass before a person spoke, weeks before they smiled, months before they sang. But when they did, no one clapped, no one praised. They simply listened, as one listens to the wind returning after a long stillness. And when it was time to leave the sanctuary, it was done gently. The sufferer was not forced back into crowds or conversation. They were reintroduced to sound, the way one reintroduces sunlight after darkness, slowly, with reverence. A harp in the distance, a chant far off, a voice speaking only when invited. Even after returning, many carried silence with them, like an amulet. They spoke less, they listened more. Some became healers themselves, understanding that solitude is not absence, it is presence, turned inward. It is where the self goes to remember itself when the world becomes too loud. Healers, too, spent time in silence, between rituals. After difficult cases, it was part of their own medicine. They knew they could not pour from a spirit that had not rested, and so they sat in still rooms, breathed, listened, waited for the echo of their own heart to return. In Egyptian belief, the soul was made of many parts, Ba, Ren, Shoit, Ibi, and sometimes these pieces became scattered, not lost, but unanchored. Silence was the thread that wove them back together. Solitude was the loom dot. Even the afterlife was imagined as a place of peace, not bustling, not noisy. The field of reeds was wide open, quiet, a place where one's name was spoken gently, where one worked without rush, where eternity moved slowly. For the Egyptians, paradise was not pleasure, it was stillness. And so tonight, as you lie in the hush between thoughts, as the world softens around you, imagine this: a quiet room of cool stone, a small bowl of water beside you, a breeze whispering in from the Nile. Nothing to do, nowhere to be, only silence, only breath. And in that silence, something healing, something returning, not a cure, but a center, not noise, but knowing. In the oldest shadows of Egypt, where the Nile curled like a sleeping god, and the stars were seen as the eyes of ancestors, there lived a belief, more ancient than even the pyramids, that a human was never truly alone. The soul, they said, was a house with many doors, and sometimes, whether by misstep, misfortune, or divine design, one of those doors could open, and someone else could step in. To the ancient Egyptians, madness was not always illness. It was not always the mind breaking, sometimes it was the mind hosting. A person's change in behavior, wild laughter, rage without cause, fear of empty corners, or a sudden speaking in strange tongues, was often not seen as a symptom of decay, but as a sign of visitation. Not all possessions were feared, some were revered. When a priestess danced with trembling limbs, eyes rolled to the sky, chanting words not her own, the onlookers did not flinch. They knelt, for in that moment they believed she was Hathor come to visit, filling the body with sweetness, intoxication, divine love, the dance of the goddess through a mortal vessel. But not all visitors came gently. There were others less kind, less known, entities that crept in through trauma, through grief, through cracked hearts and sleepless nights. The Egyptians called them Aku or Mut, depending on their nature. Some were spirits of the restless dead, others wayward gods, or fragments of cosmic chaos seeking warmth. These were not metaphors. They were real. When a person was thought to be possessed, the signs were both seen and felt. They might whisper in voices not their own, recoil from sacred objects, or grow hot even in cool chambers. Animals avoided them, milk soured at their touch. Sometimes they forgot their name, or worse, spoke a name that wasn't theirs. Healers did not blame the possessed. They did not shame. Instead, they treated them as vessels under siege, and their first task was simple: to determine who had entered. Was it a playful spirit, a grieving ancestor, a minor god, or something darker, something born of dust and forgotten places? The process of diagnosis began with ritual observation. The possessed were brought into quiet temples, surrounded by protective carvings and guarded by offerings. They were watched for patterns: what made them agitated, what calmed them, which god's name caused them to cry, which scent made them flinch. Every reaction was a clue to the intruder's identity. Once identified, the healer began negotiation. If it was a deity, they might offer praise, incense, or sacred dance, inviting the god to speak through the host, to share wisdom, or ask what it needed before leaving in peace. If the visitor was angry, the healer would apologize on behalf of the host. They did not mean to offend. They did not know the door was open. But if the possession was cruel, if the visitor harmed, tormented, refused to speak, then the healers turned to banishment. These rites were long and dangerous, performed with the help of protection spells, amulets, and sacred fire. The possessed would sit within a circle drawn in natron and ink, surrounded by symbols of Mat, the goddess of truth and cosmic order. A priestess would chant the names of order, invoking Thoth, Isis, Horus gods, who defended the balance. In her hand, she held a rod carved with the head of Sekhmet, goddess of wrath and healing. Her voice rose and fell like the Nile in flood season, demanding the intruder's name. Who walks in your skin? Who speaks in your mouth? Who dreams behind your eyes? If the spirit spoke, it was listened to. Not all intruders wanted harm. Some came out of grief. A mother who died in childbirth, seeking a new womb. A soldier who died far from home, seeking a voice to call his name. The Egyptians believed compassion could expel a spirit faster than violence. Exorcism was often an act of mercy, not war. But when compassion failed, the rituals intensified. Fires were lit. Sacred oils sharp with cinnamon and black cumin were burned to sting the spirit. Water from the Nile, blessed under the full moon, was poured across the brow of the host. "This body is not your home," the priestess cried. "This name is not yours." And slowly, the visitor would leave. Sometimes with a scream, sometimes with silence. Often, the host would collapse, sweating, gasping, trembling, but alone again. Their own breath, their own name, their own stillness. It was a sacred moment, often followed by sleep, as though the body had just weathered a storm inside the skin. Not every possession was healed so cleanly. Some hosts remained haunted, visited again in dreams, or waking to unfamiliar bruises or tears. For them, long-term protection was given. Amulets of Base, the dwarf god who defended against spirits, scarab charms, symbolizing rebirth, papyrus scrolls, hidden in bedding, filled with protective verses. It was also believed that those once possessed were closer to the veil, able to sense what others could not. Many became seers, temple scribes, or dream interpreters. They were not feared, they were honored. Their suffering had given them sight. Even children were not spared from spiritual intrusion. A child who suddenly refused to speak, who wailed without pause, or laughed in darkness, was taken seriously. Mothers would carry them to healers, offering toys, dolls, honeycakes to pacify the spirit within. The child might be bathed in moonwater, their toys left under moonlight to be cleansed. Every effort was made to bring peace to the tiny vessel. The Egyptians did not believe madness was weakness. They believed it was often a byproduct of being too open, too sensitive, too near the gods, a spiritual vulnerability, not a flaw. And so they approached possession not with cruelty, but with caution, not with fear, but with ceremony. Some temples even kept listening rooms, where those who felt visited could speak their stories without judgment. A priest or priestess would listen, never interrupting, writing down what was said, then offering a sacred object, a prayer, or simply presence. Sometimes, to name the visitor was enough to send it away. In time, if peace returned, the host would undergo a cleansing, a ritual bath, a night of sleep beneath protective statues, and a feast shared with loved ones. Possession, though terrifying, was not seen as the end but as a trial survived, one that often revealed new strength, a new path, a new self. So tonight, as you sleep, know this: the Egyptians believed the mind was not weak when it broke, only open, and what entered in that opening could be terrifying, or beautiful, or both. But with ritual, with patience, with sound and fire and compassion, it could be invited to leave, and what remained after was not just healing. It was rebirth. In the ancient lands where the Nile whispered its secrets to the wind and temples stood like still prayers against the sands, there were moments when words alone could not heal, when baths could not soothe, when music could not untangle the mind, when the heaviness a person carried was not theirs at all, but the weight of something else, something ancient, something stubborn, something that had entered without permission and refused to leave. And in such moments, the Egyptians turned to exorcism not in fear, but in deep respect. For to them, the mind was sacred ground, and if a spirit had crossed into that sacredness, it must be shown the way out with dignity, not violence. Exorcisms were not always grand affairs. Some were quiet, performed in corners of temples, in gardens, under fig trees, or beside the soft lapping of sacred pools. But every one was a ceremony. Every one a ritual of unweaving and tying the knots between the intruder and the host, separating the shadow from the soul. Before an exorcism could begin, the healer first needed certainty. Was it truly an entity at work, or simply sorrow that had taken shape? Was the mind diseased, or merely burdened? The difference mattered, for one required comfort, the other required banishment. If it was indeed a possession by spirit, by demon, by forgotten god or restless ancestor, the host was brought into a space prepared with intention. The walls were marked with protective hieroglyphs, the floor sprinkled with powdered natron and ash. At the center, an altar, not of wealth, but of memory, offerings placed carefully, dates, beer, lotus petals, bread, bits of gold or silver, depending on what the spirit might recognize or desire. Sometimes, the offering was not to appease, but to distract. Spirits, like people, were drawn to sweetness, to shine, to smell. While their attention turned toward the food or flame, the healer would begin their chants, softly at first, then louder. The goal was not to frighten the spirit away. It was to make it remember that it does not belong. These chants were ancient, passed down from priest to priestess, carved into the walls of shrines and copied onto scraps of linen or stone. They did not threaten. They named, "I call you by your true name," the priest would say. "I call you from the heat of your malice into the coolness of order." Name was power in Egypt. To speak something's name was to summon its essence. But to speak the true name of a spirit was to hold it still, trapped for a moment in the air, vulnerable. And in that moment, the healer would light a small flame or spill a line of salt across the floor, forming a barrier between the spirit and its vessel. The possessed person might cry out, or fall silent, or speak with a voice not their own. Sometimes they writhed, sometimes they wept, sometimes they sat perfectly still, as if someone else was watching through their eyes. The healer never flinched. This was not chaos, it was ritual, and the ritual was working. In certain cases, the exorcism required symbolic acts. A piece of string tied around the wrist, then cut as the spirit was named. A bowl of water held beneath the person's feet to catch what fell from them. A wax figure burned as the chant reached its crescendo, representing the spirit's departure. Offerings were often burned as well, not in anger, but in release. A spirit who had been honored named, and fed, was more likely to leave gently. The Egyptians believed that many spirits did not want to harm, they had simply forgotten how to leave, and needed help remembering. And fire was memory. The smoke rose, curling like serpent spirals toward the ceiling. The chants faded into breath. The room stilled. If the ritual was successful, the host would exhale deeply, as if releasing something they had held for too long. Some collapsed into sleep. Others stared ahead, blinking like someone waking from another person's dream. But even then, the work was not done. The healer would place amulets near the heart images of the Eye of Horus, of Bastit's protective gaze, of Anubis's guiding hand. These were not decorations. They were locks for the door that had once stood open. The host would be bathed, wrapped in fresh linen, and led into sunlight. For it was believed that even shadows feared the sun, and in the warm light of whatever fragments of the spirit remained would wither and fall away like old skin. Sometimes exorcisms failed. Sometimes the spirit resisted. In those cases, the healer would consult with other stream readers, temple scribes, astrologers. They would examine the stars, the patient's birth signs, the cycles of the moon. Healing in Egypt was collaborative, and cosmic. There were also offerings made not to the spirit, but to the gods' pleas for protection, strength, and clarity. A bowl of milk at the feet of Isis, a plate of roasted duck for Sekhmet, a garland of flowers for Mat. These were acts of devotion, but also invitation asking the divine to intervene, to help guide the lost spirit home. Some spirits never left, but they changed. With enough ritual, with enough kindness, they quieted, became watchers instead of tormentors. The host learned to live with them not as enemies, but as guests given room. In these cases, the person often became a spiritual intermediary, able to walk between the worlds. And that, too, was honored. Because in Egypt, healing was not always clean, not always total. Sometimes the goal was not cure, but coexistence. And sometimes, the true exorcism was not of a spirit, but of fear, the fear that one could never be whole again. So tonight, as you lie in stillness, imagine a room lit by soft flame, a priest or priestess murmuring your name not to summon, but to protect, offerings laid out before you, smoke rising, a weight lifting from your chest, slowly, gently, no violence, only release. You are not broken, you are not invaded, you are returning. In the hush of ancient Egypt, where the breath of the dead mingled with incense and time flowed more slowly than the Nile in summer, the art of mummification was not merely preservation, it was preparation for eternity. The body was made perfect, the soul released and reunited with its parts, but hidden among the sacred oils and ritual tools, buried beneath prayers and linen, were words far older than embalming itself, words that spoke not of the body, but of the mind. They were known as the ritual texts of stillness, inscribed in red ink on the inner linings of coffins, tucked into scrolls rolled between the ribs, whispered by priests as they made cuts through flesh and spirit alike. And sometimes, just sometimes, these texts mentioned not hunger or thirst in the afterlife, not gates or gods or fields of paradise, but madness. The ancient Egyptians believed the soul was not a single thing. It was a constellation, Kavital, essence, Ba, personality, Ib, heart, Ren, name, Shoit, shadow. And if any part was imbalanced or stained, the whole could be lost. Madness, they feared, was not confined to the living. It could follow the soul beyond death. And so, written in delicate strokes, one might find this line: "Let not my Ba forget its face. Let it not wander the corridors of shadow, speaking to walls." A plea, not for physical resurrection, but for clarity of spirit, to preserve the mind, to keep memories stitched to identity. Mummification was a ritual of control. The body was dried, stilled, bound. Every organ was touched with intention, every word spoken aloud. But the brain curiously was removed and discarded. In the logic of the Egyptians, the heart was the seat of reason, judgment, emotion. The brain was a whispering chaos, a house of dreams and madness best left behind. Still, some embalmers, perhaps more cautious or more wise, left scrolls tucked near the skull, protective spells, words to calm the wandering thoughts of the Ba, to keep it from becoming a shrieking ghost, lost in its own echoes. Silence your mouth in death. One line reads, "Do not speak what should stay beneath the sand." These inscriptions were often deeply poetic, their lines curved like the Nile itself. They warned of madness as a spiritual contagion that could infect the tomb, haunt the living, corrupt the judgment scales of Osiris. If the dead had died in mental turmoil, the soul might not pass peacefully into the next life. It might loop, reliving the fears that fractured it. And so, texts would instruct Abba, do not carry your confusion into the west. Leave it like linen at the doorway. Let the waters of forgetting wash over your mind. These were not commands. They were kindnesses. Words offered to the broken soul the way water is offered to the parched, gently with reverence. It was believed that if the soul listened, if it accepted the stillness offered, it could be whole again. But if it refused, it might become one of the mad dead. The mad dead were not zombies. They were not monsters. They were fragments of thought, without rest, wandering through dreams, whispering into minds to open, visiting the living in their sleep. They did not bite. They wept. They moaned. They stood beside beds and begged to be remembered, or worse, to be felt. Mummification then became a kind of mental surgery. Rituals were performed, not just on the flesh, but on the spirit's memory. Names of forgotten gods were whispered into ears to strengthen the soul's resolve. Sacred oils were placed on the forehead not for scent, but to seal the gates of memory. For those who had gone mad in life, special care was taken. Their wrappings were tighter, as if to contain the chaos within. Their scrolls were longer. Sometimes, tiny figurines, shabti, were placed near their head, carved not to serve in the afterlife, but to soothe, to act as companions in a realm where isolation might ignite madness anew. One funerary text found near Thebes reads, "Should my mouth forget the names of light, let the gods remind me. Should I speak nonsense, let the stars correct me. Should I scream, let the silence welcome me." It is a lullaby for the soul, a spell of gentle containment. Some tombs even included drawings of labyrinth circular, intricate paths carved into the stone near the body. These were not decoration. They were traps for madness. The belief was simple. If the mind began to unravel after death, it would become lost in the patterns and never reach the surface to trouble the living. Priests who oversaw these funerals were trained not just in anatomy, but in the language of grief, hallucination, despair. They were part exorcist, part therapist. They spoke to the dead as one speaks to a child waking from a nightmare. You are safe. You are seen. The noise is behind you now. Even the final rites, the opening of the mouth, held meaning here. The ceremony was not just to restore speech. In the afterlife, it was to ensure that the soul would not speak madness into creation, that its words would be measured, remembered, clean dot, and if the dead could not be calmed, signs of restlessness remained, statues cracked, incense refused to burn, dreams plagued the mourners, then the body might be buried with chains, not of iron, but of words, protective spells woven into the wrappings. Stay beneath, do not rise. Your place is with silence, not shadow. And yet, the Egyptians believed madness was not evil. It was unresolved grief, often, or confusion, or a spirit's last desperate attempt to find meaning. That's why they did not curse the mad. They comforted, even in death. So tonight, as your thoughts drift like boats on the Nile, imagine those linen-wrapped forms, sleeping beneath stone, their dreams guarded by starlight and spell. Imagine their fears quieted, their chaos folded like cloth, their names sung until they remembered themselves again. You are not forgotten. You are not broken. You are not alone. Even madness, the Egyptians believed, could be buried in peace. In ancient Egypt, the world was never divided between man and beast, between human and creature. The sands were alive with sacred watchers. The river whispered with scaled wisdom. The air stirred with feathered messages. Animals were not just companions or curiosities. They were symbols of the soul, reflections of mental states, and messengers between the realms of sanity and spirit. To the Egyptian mind, madness could take shape not in words, but in wings and claws. When someone lost their clarity, when their eyes darted like hunted birds, or their speech hissed with unpredictable tones, it was not simply illness. It was a shift in their inner animal, a disturbance in the harmony between soul and symbol. Each creature represented a mental quality. The ibis, sacred to Thoth, embodied clarity of thought and sacred memory. To dream of an ibis was to be reminded of order, to feel the pullback toward reason. But if the bird flew away in the dream, if its wings vanished into mist, some believed the person might awaken more confused, more lost. It was a subtle sign. The mind is slipping. The hippopotamus, sacred yet feared, symbolized the hidden rage and repressed emotion of the psyche. Calm on the surface, monstrous beneath. When someone erupted with unexplainable fury or grew dangerously silent before a sudden outburst, priests said the hippo in the heart had surfaced. To soothe such souls, offerings were made to Twaret, the pregnant hippo goddess, to transform the wildness into nurturing force. The falcon, swift and piercing-eyed, was Horus the sky, the watchful protector, the god of focused power. When a person became erratic or obsessed, seeing threats where there were none, they were said to be wounded in the eye of Horus. Healers would offer the wedget eye, the healing symbol of restoration, to call back the falcon's vision, not just sight, but perception. Snakes were dual symbols, both wisdom and chaos. A person overwhelmed by visions, or one who spoke in riddles, was believed to carry a serpent in the Belia metaphor for knowledge that twisted the mind instead of illuminating it. The solution was not always exorcism. Sometimes the snake was fed, calmed, respected. Do not kill what can be tamed, one priestess wrote in ink and prayer. The jackal, sacred to Anubis, was the walker between worlds. A mind too obsessed with death, one trapped in mourning or dreaming always of graveyards, was said to have followed the jackal too far. These individuals were treated with shadow ceremonies, not to silence grief, but to call them back to the living, to remind them that the land of the dead was not yet theirs to dwell in. The cat, sleek and sacred, represented balance, independence, and protection. But a person too detached, too emotionally cold, too secretive, was described as cloaked in fur. Healers would offer them symbols of bastard, not to change them, but to soften the edges of solitude. Even the cat curled beside others in warmth. After the hunt was done, the scarab beetle, symbol of rebirth, was often used to reframe suffering. Someone in despair, someone convinced that they would never return to themselves, was shown the scarab. Even dung becomes sacred, the priest would whisper. Even what is discarded can be rolled into something new. It was not condescension. It was hope carved in chitin. Crocodiles were feared, but also honored. They symbolized the deep, unconsciously hidden, ancient. When someone acted from strange instincts, when they responded without thought, with ancient terror or lust or violence, it was said that Sobek, the crocodile god, stirred in them. And yet even Sobek built temples. Even chaos could be civilized. Through reverence, the frog, bringer of fertility and transformation, was connected to states of emotional flooding. A mind overwhelmed with feelings, flooded by grief or joy, was likened to the frog gods of birth. Healing such a person required space, soft light, and water bathing, tears, and rest. Let the frogs settle, the texts say. Let the flood become a stream. Monkeys were symbols of mimicry and uncontrolled energy. A child who laughed at funerals, or an adult who behaved erratically in sacred places, was not punished. They were said to be under the influence of the monkey spirit. The solution: music, rhythm, a way to rechannel chaos into joy, to give shape to what was formless. The lion, sacred to Sekhmet, was fury, protection, and divine justice. A person obsessed with vengeance, or consumed by righteousness to the point of delirium, was said to be wearing the mane. Healing them required bloodletting rituals, smoke, and invocations to Matu, restore balance before the lion devoured its own heart. Even insects held meaning. A swarm of ants around a restless sleeper, or flies gathering near someone's mouth, were signs that something was festering, mentally or spiritually. In these cases, the room would be cleansed, not with water, but with fire and scent: cinnamon, cedar, mint. The person was not cleansed. The space was, because sometimes the madness belonged to the room. Birds in general symbolized thoughts, their flight, their erratic patterns, their sudden stillness. If a person began drawing birds obsessively, or reacting strangely to flocks in the sky, it was seen as a message from their inner self that their thoughts had taken flight and needed nesting. Sometimes the cure was as simple as stillness beneath a tree. Sometimes it was more complex: guided visualization, sacred dreaming, spoken ritual. Animals were not seen as lesser, but as mirrors. Every creature carried a piece of the soul, and when the soul fractured, the creature within stirred. To heal the mind, then, was to speak to the animal, to offer it space, to let it reveal what the words could not. And so, when madness crept across a person's thoughts like ants in the dark, The ancient Egyptian healer did not ask, "What is wrong with them?" They asked, "Which animal cries within?" And in answering that question, they did not banish the beast, they befriended it. In the temples of ancient Egypt, where incense curled like sacred serpents and voices echoed between alabaster walls, it was believed that the mind was a kingdom, fragile, luminous, and full of doors, and at the threshold of those doors stood, not walls, but gods, watchers, guardians, protectors of the mind. The Egyptians did not separate the soul from the divine. They believed each part of the spirit, Ka-Ba, Ren, Ibi, and Shoyat, was influenced, blessed, or haunted by unseen forces. And so, in moments of mental torment, when thoughts grew sharp as shards, or heavy as stone, it was not to physicians they turned, but to deities who ruled the realms within. The first among these was Thoth, the ibis-headed god of wisdom and balance. He was more than a scribe. He was memory itself, a protector of clarity, of right judgment, of the fine line between dream and delusion. When a person could no longer remember their own name, or confused dream with waking life, it was said they had wandered too far from Thoth's scroll. Priests would invoke his name beside the afflicted, tracing hieroglyphs into the dust around their resting place. Return their name to them, they'd whisper. Return the thread of thought. Next was Isis, great goddess of magic and mourning. Though known for her grief, Isis was also the weaver of shattered pieces. When Osiris was cut into fragments and scattered across the earth, it was she who gathered him, piece by piece. And so too with the mind. A soul broken by trauma, lost in sorrow, was said to be under Isis's wing. Offerings of milk, tears, and white linen were made to her, not for resurrection of the body, but recollection of the self. She was the goddess of integration, the one who remembered what others forgot. Then came Base, the strange and joyful dwarf god, fierce protector of children, of the pregnant, and of the soul at night. Base did not look like other gods. He was not grand, he was not elegant, but his power was fierce and personal. Those suffering from nightmares, hallucinations, or invisible voices were often given amulets carved with Bes's image. His bulging eyes and lion tongue were not to intimidate the afflicted, but to terrify the spirits that haunted them. He stood at the edge of beds, grinning at the dark. "You cannot pass," his face said. "This soul is under my watch." Hathor, the Kayad goddess of music, fertility, and joy, was another guardian of the mind. Though her methods were softer, her temples echoed with the sounds of harp, sistrum, and chanting. She was called upon when sadness became too thick, when a soul forgot how to laugh or eat or sing. Healers would bring the afflicted into sun-drenched courtyards, offer dates and honey, and play the instruments of Hathor. The goal was not distraction, but remembrance to remind the soul of light, of rhythm, of the pleasure of breath. For those overwhelmed by anger or fire of thought, there was Sekhmet, the lioness, the flame, terrible and divine. She could burn her mind to ash, but she could also protect it from the flames within. People consumed by vengeance or uncontrollable fury would be led in prayer to Sekhmet, not to be punished, but to be transformed. Through rituals involving red wine, symbolic bloodletting and fire, the wrath within was offered up to her. "Feed on this," the supplicants would say. "Take what scorches me." And often she did. Anubis, guardian of the dead and the hidden path, was invoked when the mind walked too closely with the dead. Those who saw spirits, who spoke with ancestors, who dreamed always of tombs and graveyards, were said to be walking in Anubis's shadow. He was not feared, he was respected, and so his image, jackal-headed, sleek and watchful, was placed near the afflicted, to guide their spirit back toward the realm of the living. "You are not yet for the West," the priests would say. "He will show you the way out." The goddess Nephthys, sister of Isis and guardian of the liminal, was often present in these rituals too. She ruled the spaces in between sleep and waking, death and birth, silence and speech. For minds caught in thresholds, half here, half gone, it was Nephthys who was called. Her prayers were sung at twilight, her offerings left at doorways and window ledges. She was not a loud goddess. She did not demand, she simply stood beside you in the dark until you remembered the path back. Ma, at the feather of truth and cosmic order, did not simply weigh the heart of the dead. She was also called upon when the mind lost its balance, when confusion reigned, when lies echoed louder than truth. The priests would light a feather on fire and speak her name. Let this smoke rise with the truth of this soul, they'd say. Let chaos be dissolved. Those healed in her name often became scribes, counselors, or record keepers, servants of clarity, guardians of order. Even Set, the god of chaos and storms, played a strange role. Though blamed for much destruction, Set was not evil only necessary. Disturbance, when a person's madness came from repression, when their mind cracked, not from invasion but from silence, Set was called to break the dam, to release what had been held too long. These ceremonies were the most dangerous, often involving shouting, controlled destruction, and symbolic conflict. But when done correctly, they left behind stillness. The Eye of Ra, sometimes embodied by Sekhmet or Hathor, was also used as a symbol of protection. It was painted above beds, over doors, on the wrists of the afflicted. It did not watch with judgment. It watched with warning. No harm shall enter here, it said. I am awake, even when you are not. Children with troubled minds were dedicated to Bastet, goddess of cats, protection, and calm. Her temples were places of play and purring silence. Those prone to fear or sudden outbursts were often left under her statue, given soft linen and beads to hold. No punishments, only watchfulness and warmth. In all these practices, the Egyptians did not see madness as sin. They saw it as a wound of the invisible, and just as a physical wound required bandages and salves, a wound of the mind required gods not to rule, but to guard. And so, when someone wept without reason, or laughed at ghosts, or lay unmoving for days, the priest did not ask what was wrong. He asked, which deity has stepped away? And then he called them back with incense, chant, statue, offering. He called them back to their post at the gates of the soul. Because to the Egyptians, a person was never truly alone, not even in madness. Someone divine had always been watching, and with patience, that God would return. In the land of papyrus and stone, where the breath of the gods curled with the morning mist over the Nile, the ancient Egyptians imagined no clean severance between life and death. The afterlife was not a separate realm. It was a continuation, a long and winding mirror in which the soul saw itself reflected clearly, honestly, eternally. And in that mirror, the mind was never forgotten. To live in anguish, to suffer from confusion, delusion, or despair, these were not seen as conditions. The grave could easily wash away. Mental torment, if left unresolved, could follow a soul into the fields of reeds. The Egyptians believed that the state of your heart and mind in life would shape your experience in death. The journey to the afterlife was long, perilous, and layered. With judgment, it was not enough that the body be preserved or the name remembered. The soul had to be balanced, whole, untethered by madness. For a fractured spirit might struggle to pass through the gates, might become lost among the stars, or worse, loop endlessly through its fears. In funerary texts like the Book of the Dead, the coffin texts, and spells scrawled upon tomb walls and linen, there are clues that speak softly of mental unrest, passages that beg for peace, not only of body but of thought. May my heart not rise against me, one prayer says. May I not go mad in the west. May my tongue not betray me before the gods. The weighing of the heart, that great, divine trial overseen by Mat and Osiris, was not merely a moral reckoning, it was a psychic one. The heart was thought to hold all memory, all intention, all grief. If it was too heavy with sorrow, or twisted with confusion, the scale would tip. The feather of Mat truth would rise, and the heart would fall. The soul would be devoured by Amit, the eater of the unworthy. But the Egyptians were merciful even in their myth. They believed that healing could continue after death, that if the proper rites were performed, if the correct prayers were whispered, even a tormented soul could be soothed on the other side. Families would inscribe scrolls with mental healing spells, tuck amulets into wrappings, and write the names of protective deities across the chest to remind the soul of what it had forgotten in pain. The afterlife, for the peaceful mind, was a paradise, fields forever green, rivers that shimmered, homes filled with familiar faces. But for those who carried madness with them, madness unspoken, unhealed, the afterlife could be a maze. One wandered in circles, repeating the same thought, seeking a gate that would not open. These were not punishments, they were reflections. Sometimes, the dead were restless not because they were evil, but because they had died in states of psychic fracture. They would appear in dreams, in murmurs beside beds, in the quiet scratching at doorways. And when they did, The living were urged to listen, not run, to light candles, to burn oils, to read aloud the names the dead had forgotten. In temple ritual, a priestess might whisper to the family, "He wanders still." His mind was not yet still when the breath left him, and so a healing ceremony for the departed would be held. Music, chants to Thoth and Isis, even symbolic reenactments of sanity restored. It was not for the living's comfort, it was for the soul's release. Some tombs were carved with patterns meant to soothe it, just protect, soft spirals, gentle curves, calming symmetry. The walls themselves became therapeutic landscapes, to ease the soul into sleep, to remind the mind, even in death, that stillness was possible. Dreams played a vital role. The Egyptians believed that dreams were a bridge between realms, and when someone dreamt of a loved one, mad or confused in the afterlife, it was seen as a true message. The living would then return to the temple to offer guidance, speak to him in sleep. They would say, "Give him his name again, help him remember who he is." Sometimes, new amulets were made and buried at the edge of the desert, not for the body, but for the soul. A second burial, of sorts, a gift of peace to the fragments that still wandered. It was believed that the soul could feel these offerings, and begin, at last, to rest. And yet, not all wandering souls were to be pitied. Some were revered. The mad wise ones, those who spoke in riddles, or saw beyond reason, were thought to retain their insight in death. These spirits might guide others, whisper prophecies, send dreams that healed. The line between madness and divine message was blurred by starlight. Ultimately, the Egyptians saw no shame in mental illness. What mattered was balance, whether in life or death, whether within the mind or beyond it. All things were meant to move toward harmony, clarity, truth. So tonight, as your own thoughts wander softly toward sleep, remember this: your mind is sacred. Its pain, its joy, its confusion, all of it is seen, even by the gods. And in death, as in life, you will be guided, not judged for your suffering, but held in its light. You are not broken. You are becoming whole. Even the stars remember the names of those who weep. In the moonlit temples of ancient Egypt, among the reeds and murmured prayers, the human heart was known to suffer, not only from death or disease, but from desire. And of all the afflictions that stirred the mind into restlessness, love-longing, unreturned, misunderstood, was seen as one of the deepest and most dangerous wounds. It was not the physical love that troubled them most. It was the emotional ache, the sleepless nights, the hunger that came not from the belly but from the soul, the eyes that searched the crowds for one face only, the quiet collapse when that face looked away. These were not dismissed as mere moods. The Egyptians understood them for what they were, a form of illness. Among the oldest magical texts and healing rituals in Egypt are love spells, lines of poetry, cries of desperation, commands to gods and spirits alike, to make someone see, to make someone stay. But reading between their lines, a second story emerges, that of the one casting the spell, a story not of power, but of pain, of obsession, of mental unwellness born from love. "Bring her to me," one spell reads, "with her heart burning like mine, her eyes sleepless as mine, her limbs restless as the wind." It is not a curse against another. It is a mirror reflecting a soul undone by affection. And the spell itself is not just an act of control, it is an attempt at healing. A reaching hand in the dark. Emotional illness born from love was recognized by its symptoms: lack of appetite, racing thoughts, whispering dreams, spontaneous weeping, fixation on a single name. Healers called it burning of the heart, not metaphorically, but literally, a fire that crept through the chest and disturbed the balance between body and mind. There were remedies, of course. Not all were spells. Some were scent rituals, crushed lotus petals soaked in oil, rubbed gently over the temples and wrists to calm the racing spirit. Others involved dream work, placing a slip of linen under the pillow, inked with the name of the beloved, in hopes of drawing the image closer, or letting it go. But the most telling rituals were those that merged love with madness. The spells would say, "Make him lose his mind until he comes to me." The caster already losing hers. The logic is circular, but emotionally true. The pain of unrequited love was believed to be a form of spiritual imbalance, a tether between two souls stretched to the point of shattering. Priests and priestesses did not always approve of love spells, especially when they bent the will of others. but they understood the desperation beneath them, and sometimes they offered alternatives: healing instead of binding, clarity instead of control. You do not need to hold them, they would say. You need to release the ache that binds you. This understanding extended to the afterlife. Some funerary texts include spells asking to meet a beloved in the field of reeds. Others plead, "May my heart not burn with longing in the next world." The Egyptians feared that emotional wounds, especially those of love, might carry forward into eternity if not soothed while the body still breathed. Amulets were often crafted for those in the grip of love's madness: small figurines of Hathor, goddess of beauty and desire, or Base, protector of sleep and sanity. These were placed near the heart or under pillows to calm the racing of thought, to help the afflicted find rest without reunion. In some cases, those suffering deeply were led into ritual baths, sacred pools reflecting stars. The belief was that water could carry away not only dust and sweat, but obsession. Priests would whisper into the ripples, "Let her leave you, let the name flow downstream, let the image dissolve like lotus bloom." But perhaps the most touching evidence of emotional illness in love comes from a spell found on a scrap of pottery, etched by a trembling hand. "If I do not see her, I shall die. If she does not speak, my mouth forgets how to form words. I forget myself." Here, the spell is no longer a tool of control. It is a confession, a diagnosis, a cry. In response, temple healers might perform unbinding ceremonies, rituals meant not to break another's will, but to release the sufferer from their own. Words were spoken aloud to the heart, as if it were a person. "You have loved, that is enough. You do not need to shatter for it." Because the Egyptians knew something profound, that love, in its most intense and unmet form, could resemble madness, and just like any madness, it could be healed not by scorn or silence, but by ritual, by recognition, by compassion. They did not blame the heart for its hunger. They only asked that it be tended, that it not be allowed to consume the mind entire. So, tonight, if your heart aches with the ghost of a name, let the stars above your bed be the temple roof. Let the silence be your healer. Let yourself remember, love is not weakness, but neither is its absence death. You are whole, even when longing. You are seen, even when forgotten. And no spell ever needed is greater than this, the one that returns you to yourself. In the quiet courtyards of ancient Egypt, beneath linen canopies and crumbling mud brick walls, life pulsed, not alone but together. The Egyptian soul was never meant to walk in solitude. It moved through life as a thread in a larger weave of family, of neighborhood, of temple and craft and voice. And in this interwoven world, madness was not hidden away. It was seen, it was named, and it was carried, often, by many hands. But this same closeness, this same village intimacy, was both a balm and a burden. For with the nearness of care came also the sharpness of shame. To stumble mentally in such a world was to be caught between being helped and being watched, to be whispered about even as you were held. When someone in a household began to show signs of mental illness, withdrawal, strange laughter, whispering to things unseen, the neighbors would know. Not days later, that very evening, word moved as swiftly as shadow in the desert sun. But the first response was rarely fear. It was often ritual kindness, a plate left quietly at the door, a whispered word in the market, a priest consulted without naming names. This instinct to support without confrontation was deeply cultural. To name a person's madness too openly was to risk sealing it with words. The Egyptians believed that speech had power, and to declare someone broken might make it so. So instead, they surrounded them with presence, with song, with food, with prayers whispered near, not at. Women were often the first caregivers in such cases. Mothers, grandmothers, wives. They did not ask questions. They watched the eyes, the pulse, the dreams. They anointed foreheads with oil. They placed protective amulets under pillows. They remembered how to sit in silence, how to listen when words would not come. Men, too, had roles. In the villages, older men might sit beside the afflicted at sunset, telling long stories of gods who had also wandered, faltered, raged. They reminded the mind that it was not alone in its fracture, that even Thoth had to retrieve memory. Even Osiris had to be put back together, but still, there was shame. Unspoken, yet felt like heat on the skin. A man who could not speak clearly was not trusted to trade. A woman who screamed at shadows was not invited to prepare food for others. The support was there, but the limits were clear. And this duality, compassion mingled with distance, was its own kind of wound. Some families, fearing this shame, would bring their afflicted in secret to distant temples, especially to those of Hathor or Bastet, where mental healing rituals were practiced in private. There, in the shade of columns, the madness was treated as a spiritual dissonance, not a moral failing. The afflicted were not scolded. They were sung to, bathed, painted with blue and gold pigments, as if their bodies were canvases of divine confusion. Children, in particular, were shielded. If a child showed signs of distress, crying without cause, staring into space, hitting themselves, the community rallied to protect. They were believed to be closer to the gods, and their madness was seen as sacred, not shameful. Offerings were made in their names, cradles were blessed. Stories were told of divine children who could see what others could not. But for adults, the line was thinner. To weep too long, to stare too blankly, to wander barefoot into the desert, these were signs that one had stepped too far outside the village rhythm. And though the support continued, it grew quieter, more hesitant, as if fearing contagion not of disease, but of divine attention. Because in Egypt, madness was not always internal. Sometimes it was believed to be a sign from the gods, a punishment, a message, a test. And if one person bore it, the whole village might feel watched, cursed, touched, and so. Temples were visited, not just for the afflicted, but for the community itself. The priest would anoint whole families, whole neighborhoods, praying, "Let the balance return to our hearts. Let the spirit of clarity walk among our walls." There were even festivals, soft, hidden ones for healing. Small gatherings where music was played all night, and those who had suffered mentally were given honored seats, offered the first cups of wine, the softest seats, the longest songs. These were not celebrations of madness, but of endurance, of return. Yet even then, whispers persisted. She was touched, someone might say, after a healed woman passed by. He wandered in thought too long. They'd murmur, as an elder sat silent in the sun. The wound lingered, even as the balm was applied. But in their own way, the Egyptians understood this too. That shame, like madness, required ritual, that it could be softened by repetition, by story, by the passing of seasons. And in time, the person would no longer be the one who screamed. They would simply be old, or wise, or quiet. The sharp edge of memory would dull, and the community would absorb them once more. And so, even in the contradictions of care and caution, of love and limit, the village did what it knew best. It held the suffering soul close enough to not forget it, and far enough to not be scorched by its heat. Because in Egypt, madness was never just a sickness. It was a shared weight, a ripple in the Nile. And like all ripples, it faded, slowly, gently, into stillness. In the deepest corners of Egyptian time, where temple shadows lengthen into centuries and the breath of the gods still lingers in the dust, healing was never a matter of science alone, nor was it only prayer. In Egypt, where the stars spoke and the river dreamed, the lines between magic, medicine, and mystery were not lines at all. They were threads, woven so tightly together that to pull one was to touch them all. The mind, with all its trembling beauty and terror, was treated not as a singular organ, but as a sacred horizon where the sun of clarity rose and the storms of confusion passed. And to calm that horizon, the Egyptians turned to many hands: the physician, the magician, the priest, the scribe. Each worked not alone, but in harmony. Each spoke a part of the cure. A healer might begin with the body. Oils warmed in the sun, rubbed gently across the temples, the heart, the soles of the feet. These oils were mixed, not only for their scent, but for their spiritual resonance. Herb chosen by the stars under which the patient was born. A mind troubled at night was soothed with lotus and blue chamomile. A heart burning with unnamed rage was cooled with mint and myrrh. These were not guesses, they were rites. But no treatment was complete without incantation. Words were medicine, spoken not just to the patient, but to the air, the gods, the memory of the patient's soul. Spells were intoned slowly, in tones meant to mimic the lapping of the Nile, the calls of the sacred ibis, the hush of wind through reeds. It was not performance, it was alignment, as if the soul had slipped off its track, and only the right vibration could draw it home. Even the instruments used carried power. Wands carved from hippo tusk, inlaid with tiny deities, were passed over the patient's body to trace the path of the fleeing mind. Stones with holes were held to the ear, to hear the god inside. Sacred sistrums were shaken beside the sleeping to drive away sorrowful spirits. These were ritual tools, yes, but also diagnostic ones. When a patient flinched, or wept, or stilled during a ritual, the priest knew, here is where the pain lives. No one path was ever followed alone. If medicine failed, magic was tried. If magic stalled, mystery was invoked. Some were led to oracles to speak with gods through trance. Others were taken to dream sanctuaries, where the afflicted would sleep on sacred linen in rooms painted with stars, and wait for the god to come in the dark. This was not hope, it was practice. The Egyptians believed that the gods were not aloof or silent. They were deeply involved in the illness of mortals, not just to punish, but to teach. Madness was not senseless, it was symbolic, and the healer's job was to interpret the symbol, not silence it. A person who saw visions of flames might not be sick in the body but touched by Sekhmet, calling for justice. One who heard voices in water might be haunted by a drowned ancestor, or blessed by Sobek. One who feared mirrors might carry a fragmented car, still searching for its reflection. There was no mockery in these interpretations, only meaning. The boundaries between practitioner and priest often blurred. The same man might perform surgery one day and chant spells the next. He might know how to bandage a wound and how to bandage a soul too, with linen soaked in sacred ink, wrapped gently around the wrists, to bind the self to the self again. Every illness had two dimensions, the seen and the unseen, the fever and the fear, the symptom and the story. To ignore one was to invite failure. To treat both was to begin a return, because the Egyptians knew even the body was a myth, made real through breath and belief. Patients were never seen as passive. They were participants. They were asked to speak their dreams, to confess their fears, to describe the shape of their sorrow. The answers were often poetic, not precise. "I feel like I am made of broken papyrus," one said. "I walk inside a jar with no air," said another. The healer did not laugh. He listened, because healing began with naming. Community was part of the cure. Neighbors sang outside the home of the afflicted. Children were taught to whisper blessings. When passing by, even the architecture helped. Homes were open to sun, to birdsong, to the living air. Isolation was rare, and when it happened, it was always ritualized as sacred retreat. Not a punishment, but mystery never left the room. Not all madness could be explained. Not all minds could be mended. And so, when a healer reached the edge of his art, he turned not to despair but to the gods. He lit incense. He called to Thoth, to Isis, to Mat, and he said aloud, in the presence of the patient, "We have walked as far as men may walk. Now, may the divine take over." This final act was not failure. It was humility, an acknowledgement that the mind is larger than any scroll, deeper than any spell, that some pain was meant not to be ended, but to be witnessed, with reverence, with silence. And so, healing in ancient Egypt was never only about curing, it was about restoring harmony, even if the disharmony remained, about reminding the afflicted that they were not forgotten, not cursed, not monstrous, that their suffering had place, had pattern, that even in mystery, there was meaning. In the end, healing was not the absence of pain, it was the presence of compassion, of ritual, of story, of song. And when the afflicted slept, surrounded by amulets, lulled by chant and oil and air, they did not sleep alone. They slept in the arms of a tradition that believed, above all, this: the mind is sacred, even when it breaks.